Welcome at Lowlands Assessment Systems. I am Sjoerd and this is part 1 of a series of tutorials about the enterprising domain. Our tutorials are packed with information. Please feel free to use the pause button if you want to think things over and let it sink in for a while. We've got a lot to discuss, so let's get started. In John Holland's theory about work, the enterprising domain is kind of special. It's different from the others. In some ways you could say that the other 5, so that's realistic, investigative, artistic, social and conventional, are more about one particular field of content. Subjects you can know a lot about, stuff you can be competent in. And you could see enterprising as a kind of umbrella overarching the others, adding a layer of personal effectiveness, assertiveness, and the ability and drive you need to get things done. Because of the complexity and richness of the enterprising construct, we have defined 4 underlying components: leadership, organizing, TACO or targets and competition, and last but not least, POPO, that's politics and power. This is a good time to stress that we're talking about interests and preferences. So a high score on leadership isn't proof that you are a good leader. It shows that you're very interested in being a leader. The leadership component is related to a clear sense of responsibility. Wanting to be responsible for results, but also for the people who work together to achieve a common goal. Together with the social domain, the enterprising domain is a human relations-oriented part of the spectrum of interests. Leadership is a good example of this. It's not something you can do alone, without the interaction with other people. Usually, a high score on leadership means that someone is confident and active in the interaction with others. Extroverted, probably charismatic, and convincing. They know what they want and they know how to get their ideas across. Organizing. People with a high score on this component basically have 2 things in common. The first is that they like to be active and busy. The busy bees. Being busy is good and postponing action is bad. Don't dilly-dally, no procrastinating, just get stuck in and get the job done. The second is that they want to be where the action is. More precise, they like being at the center of things. In Dutch we use the phrase like a spider in its web. Knowing who is who, where everybody is all the time, and what's going on in all parts of a project or a team. A high score in organizing shows that the person is happy in a work environment with lots of meetings and communication in all forms. They like multitasking, making appointments, progress checking. They like switching between tasks and bringing people together to get things done. With the TACO component, it's easier to understand what it is than to give it a fitting name. We struggle to find a label that gives a perfect summary in 1 or 2 words. This component could have had a number of different names, like short-term, competition, targets or commercial. That being said, I'm quite happy to use TACO, targets and competition. The TACO component revolves around having a preference for reaching short-term success. So let's break it down. First of all, there's this competitive nature, loving to win and especially hating to lose. Think of type A behavior. People who get angry when they lose at sports, are very competitive in the workplace, and also can get annoyed when they choose the slowest queue in the supermarket. If you know this feeling, you probably don't have a low score on this component. And as always, these are gliding scales and we use typical descriptions. So the higher the score, the more typical you are. An average score usually means you recognize some of the traits in your own behavior, but not others. A common example is that some people are very competitive in the workplace, but not so much in sports. Or the other way around. Secondly, there's a strong preference for short-term goals and quick results. I must stress the fact that we're talking about short-term goals here. So this is not about digging in, having a lot of stamina and eventually reaching a goal that was set ages ago. This is about here and now. Short-term. In general, the enterprising type of person is not a patient individual. And the target component is where we find the psychological source for this action-oriented default setting. So we're talking about the "come on, let's get started" feelings, the proactiveness, the restlessness. The third feature that's connected to the TACO component is a commercial mindset. Not as a source of behavior, but more as a result of the other two. If you think about the combination of a competitive personality and a focus on short-term goals, it's a small step to imagine that this matches with people who work in a commercial setting. So sales reps, store staff in retail, account managers, sales managers, commercial directors and so on will usually have a substantial score on this component. In other words, people with a high score will usually do well in a competitive work environment with sharp deadlines and other forms of time pressure. An environment with challenging goals and attractive monetary rewards. And that brings us to the fourth and last component, which I like to call POPO, politics and power. This component is based on two sources. One has to do with personality traits, with a need to be powerful, impactful and important, or the need to feel powerful, impactful and or important. The other one has to do with skills and competencies, like organizational sensitivity. Let's start with the first one, the need to feel important. This refers to the phenomenon of status awareness, the need for appreciation or even adoration. Bravo! People who appreciate the adornments of power. Think of status symbols like a corner office, or a bigger desk, or an executive parking spot next to the entrance. So there's an element of ambition and being proud of what you have achieved. And there's an element of vanity, basing your self-esteem on your perception of what others think of you. Status awareness is a complex phenomenon, so we should always be careful about drawing conclusions and always look at more factors than just the outcomes of one questionnaire. The second source for the POPO score is competence-based. People with a high score tend to understand the workplace politics and networking. They see how the game is played, the way decisions are made and the way one can get something done in the context of big organizations and red tape. Who are the decision makers? Who are the main stakeholders and influencers? A keen sense of timing is also important, knowing when to say something for the maximum effect. A high score is usually associated with working in public administration organizations, government, local governance, diplomacy or politics. To have a successful career in these environments, one has to have a fair amount of organizational sensitivity. And by definition, this of course also applies to organizational consultants, because it's their job to study and understand how organizations work. And with this we have discussed the 4 building blocks of the enterprising domain. As a bonus, let's have a quick look at an example of how you can use the scores on the various components to gain an even deeper understanding of your client. Let's compare Popo with Taco. In the politics component, the approach to get things done is more strategic than in the target component. Here on the right we see a focus on the long-term goals and lots of thinking about the consequences. And on the left we see a focus on here and now sales tactics. The short-term gain is the main goal. This is just one example of how to gain a deeper insight in people's interest profiles. The combination of these two components provides us with valuable information about how people prefer to solve problems and get things done. In the other tutorials about the enterprising domain, we will use cases to give you more examples. A lot more. Now we have an overview of what happens in the life of an enterprising individual. You get the picture. It's quite an explosion of activities. Lots of things going on and not a lot of structure. So let's get rid of this one. And there we are, the enterprising domain with underlying components, neatly arranged by someone with a high score on conventional. Speaking of which, after this tutorial you could have a look at the introduction to the conventional domain. That's all about being precise and structured. Or you could watch the tutorials with enterprising cases. Or you could go back to work, or start your own business, or take a leadership course, or organize a street party, or become chair of a sports club, or maybe politics is for you. Or you get all the stuff you don't wear anymore and start selling it online. Or you apply for the team leader position, or you go to a get-together to network, or you go to a firms to register as a new startup. Or you try to land some new customers at your mother-in-law's birthday party, or you update your LinkedIn.